Welcome to Still Plays Galaxy of Heroes. This is a list video on the single shard drop characters currently farmable in the game or will soon become farmable. When you are limited in your resources and you're trying to decide between the double shard drop character farms or the single shard drop character farms, I think it's important to break down which of those single shard drop characters can be delayed until their double shard drops and which ones make sense to prioritize a little bit earlier in your journey. Here are the characters who are currently or will soon be farmable at single shard drops. In the case of the bottom row here of Bo-Katan and Dark Trooper, they will become farmable in about 2 months. And the first column here of Cara Dune, Grief, Karga, and Mando, within about a month, near the end of April, they're going to turn into double shard drops. Now we have about 12 characters here in total, but we are going to treat them all as if they're farmable right now for the purposes of evaluating all of them. Here's the criteria I used to evaluate these characters. We considered the farming cost, what nodes they were on, what's the cost of those nodes, how difficult or easy these characters were to gear, how viable and usable they were at low gear or low stars, the late game viability. Some of these characters are more usable near the end game. Some have more practicality a little bit earlier in the mid game. The quality of the kit and their current status in the game. We didn't want to consider things like what could possibly happen with these characters in the future, because some, like the Mando squad, look like they will probably be good in the future, but right now they're not that great. Or we didn't want to consider the characters who were required for Journey or Galactic Legend characters. Because if you are pursuing a Galactic Legend or Journey character, then of course it makes sense to prioritize those requirements. A final point before we begin: if you're a regular of this channel, this is going to be rote information. But when we're talking about gearing characters, we're talking about gearing characters from Gear 7 to Gear 11, and that is because it is much cheaper to gear characters up to Gear 11 than it is to gear characters from 11 to 12. And that is one of the defining philosophies of what we try to do here in building out rosters very efficiently and give advantages to a free-to-play performance. We are doing this list in reverse order. First up, we have Cara Dune. So Cara Dune doesn't have a great home. Arguably, she's best paired with Mon Mothma as a rebel fighter, but Mon Mothma doesn't need her in order to still be effective, which makes Cara Dune expendable. Of all the Zetas that I regret, and I don't really have a lot of Zetas that I regret, Cara Dune is probably on that list. It's a conditional Zeta, which requires her to have potency up in order to get a revive. I don't like conditional things because those conditions don't always occur. She's on a 16 energy node, which relatively speaking isn't horrible, but it's not great. It takes a little bit longer. And of the Beskar Mando requirement characters, she is one of the more demanding of those characters to gear. In general, they aren't that bad of gears, but Cara Dune, she requires 3 Carbantes, 2 stun guns, 3 stun cuffs, 5 hollow projectors. There's a lot of stuff there, but there's no Kyrotech, so it's not horrible. But really, the problem with Cara Dune is there's not really any great reason to have her unless you are going after Beskar Mando, and we are not using that as a reason to be farming her. If you're going for Beskar Mando, of course, go after him. Next, we have Mon Mothma, and I'm pretty surprised that I have her here because in earlier versions of this list, I had her higher. But as I started developing the criteria, she just kept falling further and further down the list. So the issues are she's not late game viable. She's easily countered by CLS, Traya. She's susceptible to solos by Wampa and Nest. She's much better in the mid game and the early game where you can get some Geonosian light levels of viability out of them when you're going up against those shallower rosters who haven't had as much time to build out a group of rebel fighters to pair her with. But that becomes the next problem, because if you're in the mid game or early game, you may not have, or probably don't have, a bunch of rebel fighters to throw around her. So on top of having to farm and build out Mon Mothma, you are farming and building out a bunch of rebel fighters. On top of that, she is on a 20 energy node, which means you are putting on a bunch of energy expense in order to farm her. She's a tougher gear with 3 chirotechs, 2 stun guns, and worst of all are the Zetas. The Zetas are mandatory in order to get her to work. And 2 Zetas at the early and mid game, when every Zeta counts, that's a big ask. Because that's potentially 2 other teams that you could be getting those Zetas on. Like, do you put Zetas on Chirpa or Kylo and get 2 teams, or do you throw 2 Zetas on Mon Mothma in order to get a C level at best team out of it? So for those reasons, it just makes sense to wait until Mon Mothma becomes a double shard drop character, unless you're pursuing a Galactic Legend. Next up, we are looking at IG-11, and actually we are looking at IG-11 and Quill as a pair, because in order to get the maximal utility out of them, you really need to have both, and that's also a big part of the reason why they've fallen down on this list, because you need to have 2 characters farmed at that single shard drop rate, which is going to use a lot more resources than just having to go after 1 character, or instead using those resources on double shard drop rate characters. On top of that, the gear demands on them is a bit larger than some other characters. They don't have any chirotechs required, but in the case of IG-11, he needs 5 Carbantes, 2 stun guns, 3 stun cuffs, and Quill needs 4 Carbantes, 3 stun guns, but no stun cuffs. So that is a big amount of resources for characters that don't have the most amount of utility and viability. Of the 2, we have Quill a little bit higher because of that revive, because of the shared stats, and because he has a lot more control, which gives him a slight edge over IG-11. But they are still decent characters. Here is some footage from several Grand Arenas ago where I used a 5-star IG-11, 6-star Quill at Gear 10 to clean up this Gear 12 Bastila Shan Palpatine fight, and I was very surprised at how they were able to manage, basically because of their kits, the debuffs from Palpatine and Bastila Shan weren't effective with them, and allowed me to clean up this team when I was scraping the bottom of my roster. Here we have Bo-Katan, and Bo-Katan is the character most likely to move several spots sometime in the future. I really like her kit. I really wanted to put her higher, but based upon the game right now, the Mandalorian faction still seems to be a work in progress, but the potential is getting there. So here is footage from my most recent Grand Arena. This is a little deceptive because these are Gear 8 characters going up against a Gear 9, Gear 10 Trooper team. But you can start seeing how the synergy is starting to work out with these Mandalorian characters, where the Beskar from the armor is guaranteeing a counter, which is guaranteeing an assist from Gar Saxon, meaning that they are always attacking on offense or on defense, and it starts looking pretty interesting. I'm going to gear these characters up and see how much more effective they are. Look at that Gear 11 range that I like to test characters out at. In addition to the Mandalorian faction still being a work in progress, the gearing requirements aren't the easiest, for the biggest reason being she needs 3 chirotechs, 1 at Gear 8, 1 at Gear 9, 1 at Gear 10. But other than that, the rest of the gearing requirements aren't awful. 1 stun gun, 2 carbs, 3 stun cuffs. But it's really limited by your chirotech income, which earlier in the game is going to be a bit slower. But she does have a little bit more viability from having a newer kit that shares some stats, which means she is going to be more usable at lower stars and at lower gear. So she's a character I'm really rooting for and hoping the Mandalorian faction gets a little bit better, maybe with Pre-Vizsla's son or whoever is the big tanky guy in The Mandalorian. Next we have Dark Trooper, who is a character I kept trying to rate lower on this list, but I couldn't bring him any lower than the number 6 spot. So just like IG-11 and Quill, who I penalized because you need to farm 2 single shard drop characters in order to get viability, Dark Trooper you really need to also farm Moff Gideon in order to get the viability out of the Dark Trooper. He's also not very viable at low gears and low stars. I've heard around 5 stars he starts getting a lot better, but at 3 stars where I have him, I wasn't able to get a ton of usage out of him. But on the positive, I can't really penalize him for the gear issue because he's such an easy character to gear. So with the gearing, he only needs 1 Chirotech, which is no big deal, 1 stun gun. He does need 4 Carbantes and 2 stun cuffs, but when you only need 1 stun gun, that's not a huge deal to have to work around. And I'm not able to bring him any lower because he's a good character, he does big damage, and most of all, he has a defined usage. He has a team that you know you can put him on, which I cannot say about Bo, Quill, IG-11, and Cara Dune. Dark Trooper stays on the lower half of this list though, because most of his viability doesn't seem to occur until you get him to 7 star and relics, and the other characters on this list you can start getting a lot more usage much earlier in the game. At number 6 we have the armor. I think there's an argument to be made that the Dark Trooper could move from 7 to 6 because the Dark Trooper has a defined team, but the armor is much more viable at low stars and at low gear because of how the Beskar buff works. The armor can be paired with GLs and make them unbeatable. The armor can be a part of certain counters, and the flexibility of how the armor works for me brings her up to number 6. And also anytime you're trying to build out any kind of Mandalorian squad, the armor has to be there. On the negative though, the armor is the single worst character to gear on this list. The armor requires 4 Chirotechs at multiple levels. At one of those levels, 2 Chirotechs are needed, or 2 pairs of Chirotechs are needed on that level. She needs 3 stun guns, 4 carbs, 1 cuff, 3 hollow projectors. That is a bunch of gear for this character. And on top of that, she's on a 20 energy late game node, which means you can't get started on her until late, and she's going to take a long time to farm, which all brings her further down this list. Now as we enter the top 5, we start getting to characters that make a lot more sense to prioritize. Mando though is right on the edge, but is becoming a double shard drop character in about a month. So the problem with Mando is his kit is really not that good at all. Disintegrate is doing a lot of work. When it comes to other characters who have comparable abilities like Nihilus with Annihilate or Rex with Aerial Advantage, those characters are very decent characters despite their Annihilate type of ability. Nihilus has a Dispel and increased cooldowns. He has a lot of control. Rex has turn meter up and a cleanse. Those abilities are great. Rex used to be a great mishmash leader. Mando, you pull away his contract, his payout, he is a bad character. Other than the ability that he can ignore taunt and help get some contracts like Jango and Boba Fett can, the Mando's kit is no good. But I found it hard to rank him lower on this list because he's on 2 nodes, one of those nodes being very cheap. The Beskar Mando requirement characters are clearly designed to be very early game attainable. Of the Beskar Mando requirement characters, the Mandalorian is fairly easy to gear. He's the only one though that requires Chirotechs, but only 2, and he needs 1 I think at Gear 8 or Gear 9, and 1 at Gear 10. Only 2 stun guns, 4 carbs, 2 stun cuffs. Not really a huge demand. So fairly easy to acquire, fairly easy to gear up, and he has an ability in Disintegrate, which is a big counter move. The big problems though is he's not as viable at low gear or low stars because of how fragile he is. I find when I was building him up and trying to get his contract off, and still at 7 stars Gear 11, when I do get his contract off, I feel like I would have won the match anyway. Or I find when I'm trying to go up against other teams and try and use Mando to beat other teams that might be out of reach, then the Mandalorian is taken out fairly quickly by AoEs or bigger attacks when I don't have a taunt to distract. So for those reasons, Mando is brought down. At number 4, we have Greef Karga, a character that I love, and a character whose kit makes the Bounty Hunter faction much more dangerous. In his kit, you get a heal, you get healing and protection recovery, you get retribution, you get a mass attack, you get daze on his basic, and he starts out every match under stealth, which allows him to be much more viable at lower gear and stars because he cannot be targeted right away. All of that means is you get a much more resilient bounty hunter faction out of him, which is why on my new account I went after him right away because he's also very cheap to farm. He's on 2 nodes, one being a 12 energy node, the other being a 20 energy fleet node, but those 2 nodes mean you can go after him very quickly, and I wanted to pair him with the rest of the bounty hunters to go after a Chewie unlock earlier than you could before, and I want to see if you can get Chewie with a much smaller headache than it used to take. What holds Greef Karga back though are 2 semi-negatives, not a huge problem, but one is the gearing. It's not awful, but he does require 3 carbs, 2 stun guns, 3 stun cuffs, but no chirotechs. It's a lot of stuff, but not a lot of stuff in any single piece of gear except for hollow projectors. He needs 5 of those, but that's a cheap piece. What really holds him back for me is he doesn't really elevate the Bounty Hunter Squadron or the Bounty Hunter faction to beat any other teams that they wouldn't have beaten anyway. He just makes it easier for them to do so. He does make it a little bit harder to counter them, but not enough of a difference to really elevate him higher than this slot. Next, we have one of my personal favorites in Admiral Piatt, who completely elevates the Empire and Imperial Trooper factions. With the Emperor's Trap, he is able to help auto assault battles. He makes doing the dark side territory battles a ton easier. When he's paired with Vader and Merciless Massacre, Emperor's Trap makes that completely devastating. On top of that, when he became announced as farmable on a 16 energy node that's relatively early game, that he is the biggest reason why I even started a new account. I wanted to see what he would do to the early game, how he would pair up with Imperial troopers who are easy to farm, and how he would pair up nicely with Vader in that early game, and what damage that they could do as an early game pair. On the negative side, he is a fairly expensive gear. He needs 3 chirotechs. 2 of those chirotechs occur at gear level 10, so you need to have 100 of each chirotech piece in order to move up from 10 to 11. He needs 2 stun guns, 3 carbs, 4 stun cuffs, 5 hollow projectors. Like, he just needs a lot of stuff, and that all slows down his development. His gearing has really been designed to slow down early game players, so they can't take full advantage of him too early. But with how his kit has been designed, it doesn't matter that much, because once you throw the Imperial Ambition marked buff onto Stormtrooper or another Empire character, he goes under stealth and he does great. And with those stacks of inevitable failure, when the Stormtrooper is eventually taken out, Piatt gets a bunch of health and protection to really beef up his character, which all mitigates some of those issues with gearing and leveling up and starring him up in this near term, because he's not going to become a double shard drop character for still another 6 months or so. With the final 2 slots, I went back and forth between these 2 characters because both of them are deserving of the number 1 spot, but ultimately I went with Moff Gideon at number 2. So with Moff Gideon, he was put on an extremely cheap 10 energy Cantina node, which means he's a super fast farm. On top of that, he is an extremely easy character to gear up to gear 11. And remember, we are focusing on getting our characters to that gear 11 staging ground because of how much more expensive it is to go from 11 to 12. But for Moff Gideon, it is no carbs, no stun guns, no chirotechs to go from gear 7 to gear 11. That is amazing. He needs a couple stun cuffs, he needs some droid collars, but all of that is not a big deal when you're talking 3 of the most annoying pieces of gear in the game, and Moff Gideon does not require any of them. On top of that, his kit is fantastic. He makes the Imperial troopers way tougher. I use gear 11 and gear 10 troopers to regularly beat Relic Night Sister teams. That's how much viability that Moff Gideon adds to an existing trooper squad, where teams that General Veers would not be able to handle, Moff Gideon is able to handle easily. Now that Moff Gideon has been released on a cheap Cantina node, there's a strong argument that Moff Gideon should be one of the starting teams in the game. When I started the new account and was experimenting with Piatt, Moff Gideon wasn't available at the time, but I went with a starting group of Veers, Range Trooper, Snow Trooper, Magma Trooper, and Stormtrooper. With Moff Gideon there, that eliminates a light side, dark side farm in Veers and allows you to very quickly build out a very strong team with Moff Gideon. And with Moff Gideon, like Piatt, he can help auto the Rebel Roundup assault battle, but ultimately he stays at number 2 because at number 1 we have Chupio. And with Chupio, the reason he is at number 1 is because with Chupio added to a CLS squad, you can now beat meta teams. This is an A-tier team, if not higher. This is a great squad, and Moff Gideon cannot make that same argument. Both Moff Gideon and Chupio are viable at low stars, they're viable at lower gear, they just get better. With how they are sharing stats, they are both very powerful at that lower thresholds. Chupio, though, is a little bit of a harder gear. He does require 3 carbs, he has 2 stun guns, but only 1 chirotech, and then there's 3 stun cuffs. So it's much more demanding. But what's nice about most of the characters on this list is none of them are like those crazy characters like Sun Fac or General Kenobi that require just 4 Carbantes at a single level, or even 8 or 9 Carbantes overall to gear them up. So all of these characters are much more manageable to build out your roster with. Another great thing about Chupio is that Zeta is not necessary. It is much more necessary at higher gear because the damage just ramps up that much more. But at lower gear and stars, what you really want are the shared stats that he's offering and all those assists that he's doing, and you can get away with not having the Zeta at those lower gear and star counts. Chupio can also help auto that assault battle for the rebels. The one big downside with him, though, is he is an expensive and slow farm with a 20 energy node. The last factor that really separates Chupio and Moff Gideon is Grand Arena and PvP elements within the game, is that Chupio is great on both defense or offense, and Moff Gideon is much more of an offensive only team. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I really appreciate it. I'd like to make videos like this more regularly, but to give you an idea behind the scenes, this video took me about 12 hours to make. So if you could subscribe to the channel, it makes it a lot more easy for me to justify putting the amount of time into these kinds of videos as I'd like to do. So thank you again. Be safe out there, everyone, and be excellent to each other.